Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we're going to be listening to true, scary hunting stories. I hope you enjoy them. So without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. This may not be the scariest story, but it sure did put fear into us at the time. Years ago, a friend and I decided to go raccoon hunting on a large wooded piece of land that my family owns on a lake. We met at his house at about 11 p.m. and set off walking the half-mile down the dirt road into the woods. We talked in low voices, catching up on things, and then we quieted down when we reached the fence where the property line was. We loaded our .22s and started looking for signs of our prey. The woods weren't totally quiet. They were full of country sounds. Frogs singing on the lake, owls hooting back and forth in the trees, even mice running over the leaves that had fallen the previous fall. I was amazed by how much a tiny little rodent can make so much noise. This whole time we weren't really talking, just steadily walking through the dead leaves and pausing to listen to the sounds around us. Suddenly, completely out of the blue, the woods went dead silent. No frogs, no mice, no owls, nothing at all. My friend and I stopped in our tracks at the exact same time. The frogs stopped. What the heck? We stood there for a minute or so in dead silence, listening for a larger animal. We're not in bear country, so it couldn't be that. Branches breaking, something. Nothing but the sound of our breathing. I think we should leave. Yep. We clicked the safeties off on our rifles and got out of there as hastily and at the same time as cautiously as we could manage, feeling a surge of adrenaline as we went. We didn't think to unload our rifles until we were a little more than a halfway back to his house. Later, we both admitted that the silence dropping like that triggered something akin to an anxiety attack. I've been back to those woods several times since then, both in the daytime and at night, and I never experienced anything close to that feeling. Never saw a coon that night either. I was hunting for black bear one day, back in the early 2000s. The area that I was hunting was in northern Clinton County. My ex-brother-in-law and I enjoyed the area and spent many a season scouting and hunting these lands in central Pennsylvania. This part of the county is filled with log hollows, steep inclines, and hard-to-access trails. We both like to do our own thing and hunt separate terrains. I would often drive down into the hollows while he scoured the ridge lines, hoping to get a shot at whatever I pushed over the tops. We both carried pretty bumped up two-way radios to keep a general idea of where we were, although often the terrain made it difficult for good reception. This day was a typical Pennsylvania bear season day. It was on the Wednesday of the season, third and last day of the brief season it was back then. The woods were quiet, with no distant whooping and yodeling of various opening day camps, pushing drives through the woods. The weather was cold, gray, and windy when we separated to begin our hunt and continued on throughout the day. I spent the day still hunting down this long hollow south of a little town in northern central Clinton County, with the idea of meeting my brother-in-law at the top of a ridge at the agreed time of 4 p.m., giving us both plenty of time to hike together the few miles back to his truck. After hunting all day, I found an old game trail that appeared to meander its way back up the ridge line towards where I knew he would be waiting for me. After close to an hour, maybe around 3:30, I made my way 2/3 of the way to the top, stopping often, scouring the slope for that jet black fur of a roaming bear. Along the trail, I came upon a long ago used fire ring. It was very rudimentary in its build and appeared to be used only once. The ring's rocks were covered in lichen and only had the faintest traces of black from a long ago fire. I found it odd that a fire ring would be here, considering the steepness of the slope, but it was a very small, somewhat leveled ledge. There I figured I would set and eat the rest of my packed food and sit still, hoping to catch a final chance to see a bear. All the while it felt odd, somewhat unwelcoming, like I shouldn't be there. Almost like I was a forbidden interloper on someone's valued spot. I sat for maybe 20 minutes and thought that it was time to continue the trek upward to my friend. As I stood, I slung my backpack on and reached down to sling my rifle over my left shoulder. As I stood up, I heard my name called loudly. It didn't really sound like it was behind me, rather all around in my head. Just as I was going to turn around, my rifle was slapped off of my shoulder. I felt the force, heard the sound of something slap against the wood of the stock, and crouched quickly to save my gun from dashing onto the rocks at my feet. I grabbed it just in the nick of time, and quickly turned around with a mouthful of words for whom I thought was going to be my brother-in-law jacking with me. There was nobody at all there. Absolutely no way could anyone had rushed off without me either seeing or hearing them. I felt a sick feeling in my churning stomach, chills throughout my body. I muttered a few Hail Marys and sped up to the top of the bridge, met my bud, and quietly we hiked our way out of the woods to his truck in the spreading dark of evening. This has bothered me for years, and I have not been back in those particular woods since. But someday, I do hope to. My family has been hunting for years. It's a tradition with us. This is a story about the second time I went elk hunting. We live in Wyoming, and there are tons of places to hunt elk around here. We were on Battle Mountain, right on the Wyoming/Colorado border. We were hiking down a small ravine. It was a long hike, and we had already hiked a few miles. The point is, we were already a bit worn out. There are mountain lions, bears, wolves, and coyotes in that area. The only two that are dangerous are the first two. The one that's scarier is the first. I had heard of stories of people being stalked by mountain lions, but never imagined that I would be on the receiving end of one of those situations. Anyway, we were hiking when I heard a sound. This sound, I had heard nothing like it before. At first, I thought it was an idiot with a chainsaw or dirt bike. The sound rose in pitch and transformed into a snarl. Right then, my dad, brother, and I froze. There's something about that sound that makes your legs stop moving without you realizing it. It makes the hairs on your neck stand up, and you become hyper-aware. We stood like that for around 30 seconds, but let me tell you, it felt a lot longer than that. We all gave each other looks as if to say, "Am I going crazy? Did you hear that?" Arguably, the scariest part was we never saw him. In the ravine, it echoed like crazy. An unseen fear is the worst one that I can think of. Needless to say, we were on edge for the rest of the hike. I never went back there. The area is beautiful and as serene as anything you could ever imagine. But you had better watch your back. This event occurred with a friend from out of town, whom I had invited for an afternoon hunting trip. The location was in South Louisiana, an area characterized by thick woods and tall palmetto up to 6 feet high in some places. The water that we had to traverse to reach my deer stands was at times up to our waist, making the mile-long journey to our deer stands slow-moving. My friend, unaccustomed to this challenging terrain, managed to keep up. Upon reaching the first stand, positioned 15 feet above the ground with a ladder for access, I informed him that I would return to pick him up about a half an hour after dark, as my stand was a half mile past his. We had a full moon that illuminated the water, allowing us to extend our hunting time. When darkness finally set in, I descended from my deer stand with my rifle on my shoulder and began walking slowly towards my friend's stand. As I approached, I shone my light upward, only to find that he wasn't in the stand. Focusing the light on the ground beneath the stand, I discovered him leaning against the tree that it was affixed to. Oddly, he wouldn't meet my gaze, even after calling his name. Closing the distance, I asked if he was ready to leave. When he finally turned to look at me, the sight was unsettling. His eyes were rolled back, and his mouth was wide open as he stood there, unresponsive to my questions. Fearing the unknown, I positioned my rifle between us. He remained in this eerie state, not uttering a word or responding to my questions. Stranded a mile or so in the deep woods, surrounded by thick palmettos and waist-deep water, I was unnerved by the bizarre behavior of my once familiar friend. Desperation prompted me to slap his face, bringing him back to reality. I asked if he was okay, to which he replied with urgency, "Let's get out of here now." Shocked, I had him walk ahead of me on the way back to the truck, maintaining a vigilant watch. Once inside the truck, we departed without exchanging a word. Confused and concerned, I pressed him for explanation. Tearfully, he recounted an encounter in the woods. While sitting in the stand, he heard something approaching through the water and rustling palmettos. When the mysterious figure came into view, he described it as a man who appeared to be skinned alive, devoid of any skin. Terrified, he climbed down and hid under the stand against the tree, hoping that this person wouldn't spot him if it returned. His state of shock and distress, when I found him, was a result of this harrowing experience. A week later, during a conversation with my cousin, who had visited a nearby Indian memorial, I learned about a tribe that historically skinned individuals alive as punishment for serious crimes. My friend, unfamiliar with the area, had no prior knowledge of this tribal practice. The unsettling question lingers. Did he witness the ghost of one of these skinned individuals from years past? I can't say for certain, but the haunting image of my friend that night in the woods is etched into my memory. When I was a kid, my dad had a membership in a hunting club. The old guys used to tell me all kinds of scary stories, and I was scared of the dark, and the woods in the dark in particular. The scariest story was about the old one-eyed man that lived down in the swamp. I don't remember any particulars of why it was scary, but a one-eyed man in the swamp was scary enough for me when I was 10. Of course, the first time I sat by myself and killed my first deer was in said swamp, at the very end of a long logging road. When I shot the doe, I expected my dad and his friends to show up immediately to load the deer up like they said they would. Did they? No. I sat waiting for what felt like an eternity. I knew if it got dark, I was a goner when the old one-eyed man showed up and dragged me into the swamp. I ended up hightailing it up that old logging road about 2 miles to the camp to find my dad and his buddies drinking and cooking supper while I waited for my fate with old One-Eye. I know it sounds silly, but man, was I scared at the time. I hunt a very rural area of land in Michigan. One year, a buddy and I heard some very faint screams while out in the blind. We couldn't make it out, but it sounded like it could have been someone calling for help. We just looked at each other and kind of chuckled, thinking it was one of the dudes in the camper down the road drunk. Fast forward a couple of days, and we heard that there was a report of a missing man and female in our area of the woods. Snow got too deep, and the search was called off. Once springtime thawed everything out, they ended up finding them both frozen to death. Makes me think about what I could have done to help in that situation. This was one of my first outings as a kid by myself in the woods, and I had decided to go out for an afternoon set. I sat past sundown as I was familiar with the trail and knew that I'd have no problem finding my way back. As I was gathering my stuff together and about to climb down from the tree stand, I heard these god-awful screams that, in my young mind, was convinced was a woman getting murdered or some kind of monster. I jumped off of the stand and ran back to the cabin as fast as I could, and I told my father and grandfather about it, who both looked at each other with frightened looks on their faces, and proceeded to tell me about a local legend of a witch that lived in the woods that we were hunting in. I was scared to death to ever go hunting in those woods again, by myself, so I would always insist that my dad or grandfather would go with me. It wasn't until a few years later, when my grandfather had passed, that my dad told me the truth, that it was probably just a fox. They make a horrible screaming sound during mating season. He said that they both knew what it was right away, but my grandfather and him thought that it was funny, and my grandfather didn't want to tell me the truth because he really enjoyed the fact that I would ask him to go out hunting with me every time after that, and he didn't want that to change. During bow season, a roommate of mine killed a large doe around 9 p.m., then waited for me to get home at 12 a.m. to go track it a few miles in the woods. Thick forest made seeing without a good flashlight impossible. We had 4 headlamps, tracked the blood for an hour, then found the doe dead in a stream. We gutted it, then had to pull it a few miles back to the car. 3/4 of the way back, we heard a loud howl, then another one, and another one just 100 yards away. All of our headlamps except for one died. We pulled the doe to the edge of a field about 200 yards away from our car, and in the tree line right next to us, we see a pair of eyes. Then another walk out behind it. Then 2 more pairs of eyes. For about a mile, we had been tracked and followed by a pack of 4 large canine-sized coyotes. As we pulled the doe across the field, the coyotes completely circled us, and we had to hop up on hay bales for a few minutes, because one coyote got within 10 yards of us. Mind you, all we could see was eyes and a silhouette of them. We had no weapons beside a single gutting knife. Finally, the one coyote backed away a little, and we grabbed the doe and just ran as fast as we could back to the car. We shined a light back, and 2 more coyotes joined the pack, equaling 6 total, and they were about 20 yards away by the time we made it to the car. There's nothing like being tracked by a pack of coyotes for a mile in a pitch-black dense forest, then being surrounded and only seeing their eyes and silhouette. After that, forget going into a forest without a firearm. When I was a kid, my dad and I were deer hunting in the Buck Cliffs. We found a tanker bunk and started closing the gap. The buck went over a ridge and started working down. We got to the top of the ridge and could see the rack from above. It was a very steep hill, heading down to a Forest Service road. We got down and started crawling. After what felt like an eternity, we see an old truck hauling up this road. Mind you, we are wearing blaze orange. We get to within a couple of 100 yards of this deer in a south-facing slope with 0 cover. This deer makes a move up towards us, and my dad and I lay down behind the stump of a bush. The guys in the truck jumped out of the truck and started shooting right in our direction. I heard one bullet sizzle up and to my right. Bullet 2 hits a stump to my dad's left. My dad jumped on top of me, and I heard shot 3 and 4, but did not see where they went. This whole time, my dad is yelling and waving his orange hat. I looked up and saw my dad sim his rifle, at these guys I assume, and then heard truck doors slam and the truck leave out towards town. We end up calling the sheriff in town. This was before cell phones, and have a description of these guys in the truck. The sheriff knew exactly whose truck it was and went to their house and confronted the guy. They couldn't get him for shooting at us, but they did get him on a DUI and a person in possession of a firearm that was not allowed to have one. I was out scouting deer earlier this year. I was deep into some public lands in rural North Carolina, which can get pretty deliverance pretty quickly, so I was already on edge. I started seeing a bunch of bear sign, scats, prints, etc. So I added that stress on top of whatever I already had. I stumble on a huge mess of bear prints and torn up earth that looks like it just happened, and I immediately start thinking, what the heck? Now I'm going to get eaten by a bear. This is how it ends. I start making some noise, like lots of noise, hoping to scare it off if it's near. Thinking it's late summer in North Carolina. That bear can't be that hungry. 30 seconds later, I hear grunting and snuffling off to the side. Heavy breathing punctuated by snorts and the occasional grunt or twig breaking, as whatever it is lumbers along. And whatever it is big. Like, huge. And it's moving right towards me. I dropped my backpack and pulled out my hatchet that I brought along, just in case I needed to clear out a shooting lane, or clear any fallen trees in the road. My heart is pounding, and I'm thinking that if I survive, I'll probably need some new shirts. I'm waving my arms. Hey bear. Hey bearing at the top of my lungs. But it just keeps getting closer. I'm ready. I'm gonna fight a bear. This is it. My Leonardo DiCaprio moment from The Revenant. At least I'll go out fighting. And then, a horse pops its head out of the trees. What the heck? Where did this horse come from? I stand there staring at it. It staring at me, calm as can be. Each other just wondering what the other's plan is. And then he just dips his head and walks off the other way. I took a moment and then kept on scouting. I still have no idea where that horse came from. I was told that you guys might like this. This happened when I was growing up, around 2004 or 2005, when I was about 13 years old. It took place in a rural area, a good ways outside of Uvalde, Texas. The town itself was really small back then and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that really isn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres, I think, down outside that area, and was complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on hogs in the south, my dad thought that he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, but also gave us some quality father-son time. I remember the drive down there from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfy. I hated it. All I had to do was either stare out the window or try and beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something that I was never able to accomplish in my youth. The drive obviously took most of the day, so we got there early in the evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it that year yet, and the cabin and the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care. At this point in my life, I had been in scouts for a couple of years and spent a lot of my free time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was pretty comfortable roughing it. So after unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land, we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough, dust and dirt everywhere, flies. I remember that it looked like some raccoons had gotten into the cabin and messed on the floor. After cleaning up a bit and getting the sleeping bags out, then setting up the cots, we decided to sleep. Something about that night was weird. I never was able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I had that feeling of being watched. I was finally able to drift off for what I guessed was an hour maybe. When I woke up, it was early, about 7 a.m. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs and find a good place to set up a blind. It was the summer and horribly hot in the afternoons, so morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for an hour or so, we came to an area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some signs of hogs. Typical torn up ground where they had been rooting, so we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away. Some of their body was blocked by trees. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got to the lease that nobody was there. Not to mention the gate was locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing some bright-colored red jacket. We slowly walked towards them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we're hunters. This is private land." The person didn't move at all. Dead still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that he was turned away from us with his hands in his pockets. Weird thing was that the person was in a ski jacket and what looked to be ski pants. Now this is Texas in the summer. It was about 98 degrees outside by then. My dad called out again. No reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnap the clip to his pistol holster. That's all we had at the time since we were only scouting the area. The rifles were back at the cabin. We approached the person's right side, and then my dad told me to stay put about 20 yards away. I stayed and crouched down, watched him circle around from the man, all the while talking to him asking if he was okay. He finally passed around to the front of the man, and my dad stood straight up with a confused look on his face. I called out and said, "What's wrong?" And he called back saying, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to it while my dad stood there staring, and as I got closer, one thing stood out the most. The clothes it was wearing were brand new. No dust, sap, bird droppings, or signs of being outside for more than a day at most. At that moment, I looked at my dad and I could see him getting worried. Almost immediately after, I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched, and I knew that my dad had felt it too. I wanted to start crying. I remember feeling suddenly so scared. My dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back while I was trying to hold back panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was terrified, so it felt like an eternity, but in reality was only about 45 minutes max. After returning, we packed up and beat feet. We drove back home that day and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he had never had an issue with people because his property was highly fenced. My dad normally isn't a paranoid person, but me being young and the least possibly having someone there that we didn't know about, he decided to just be cautious and just get out of there. After we got back home, we talked, and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling, but didn't want to wake me up because he thought that I was sleeping too. Turns out that next week, he got a call from his buddy, and he checked the whole property and never found a trace of anyone. No mannequin or anything. That story still makes my hair stand on end. No idea what was happening, but the paranoid man in me thinks that it was some kind of trap or something. Not the creepiest thing that happened to me in the woods, but definitely in the top 3. I was hog hunting deep in the palmettos. I was all by myself this time. The sun was setting and I started to see some hog movement about 200 yards away from me. I started to move that way very quietly with the wind in my face. As I got deeper into the palmettos, I could hear the hogs grunting. I stopped and listened to gauge how far away they were. Then I got my knees taken out by a big fat sow. This was probably the hardest I've ever been knocked on my butt. It was like a car hit me. I could see another hog running towards me, so I took out my .40 and domed it near point blank. My buddy and I are both police officers, so we were allowed to carry a firearm into public land, where the general public is not allowed to. We are from Texas. We went hunting one morning to a new place where we saw a lot of deer activity, about a 2-hour walk from the truck. We both bow hunt in tripods and wear full-body ghillie suits. The location where we hunt only allows bow hunting. About 1 hour after the sun comes up, some random guy started walking around towards our direction, carrying a bolt-action rifle while smoking a cigarette. He makes it about 40 yards from me and I took my headgear off, and I told him some stuff, probably not in the nicest manner. The gentleman walks in closer and decides to point his rifle at me. The rifle was a .30-06 and had 1 round in the chamber. At this point, I decided to laugh and told him to think twice about his decision. My buddy to my left, which he did not see, was a full draw with his bow with a very heavy arrow and very sharp broadhead. I told him to look, and you could see the fear in his eyes. He lowered the rifle, and we both in an instant had him at gunpoint with our handguns. We tied him up using zip ties and called the game warden. The entire walk back, he did not say a word. They met us at our trucks. They took him into custody for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. When they ran his name, he had 2 murder warrants out, 1 out of Louisiana and 1 out of Kentucky. He was sentenced to life in prison a year later. We did go back to our tripods, and we both got a deer that day, and a good story. About 4 years ago, me and some of my friends were driving down a rural road in the Maine wilderness. I was driving pretty slow, and we were talking about college. All of a sudden, out of the woods on the left side of the road, a woman walked out in front of the car. She was our age, early 20s, kinda short, 5'3" maybe, and she had blonde hair. She was wearing a flannel shirt over a white shirt and jeans, but there was some blood on her shirt and hands. Not a lot, but a noticeable amount. She stopped on the right side of the road and turned to look at us. My friend rolled down his window and asked if she needed help. She said that she could use a ride to the nearby gas station, and we agreed to drive her there. She got in the back with 2 of my friends and we went on our way. She was quiet until my friend asked if she was hurt because of the blood. She said no, that she had been hunting something big. We assumed that she meant deer, and friend number 2 said that he hunted deer too. She said that was cool, but not what she had been hunting. We arrived at the gas station and she got out and went in. We waited for her to come out, but she didn't, so we left. Now we wonder what exactly she had been hunting, if not deer. Also, I'll add a couple more things. This was at night, around 10 or 11 p.m. Only friend 2 had been drinking, and only a little bit. And we all remember this clearly, and we have all brought it up since. My family deer camp is still a tent camp in northwestern Michigan. We have a 16-foot by 16-foot Korean War era canvas tent for sleeping and a Boy Scout wall tent for cooking. Anyway, we used to camp in a small clearing on public property that's about 50 yards from the road. One night, I was woken up at around 3 to 4 a.m. by the sound of the scariest, loudest scream I've ever heard. It was just one long, single scream, but it sounded like a woman was being murdered about 100 yards away from me. Nobody else in the tent heard it, or was woken up by it. To this day, I still don't know what it was, but I have to guess something like an owl or a fox. Another time, I was walking to my ground blind, I think on an opening morning of firearm deer season. I walked up a 2-track road about a quarter mile to my trail, which I have marked with a reflective pen, but I almost never walk in with a light on, as I can see pretty well in the dark. As I was walking, it just felt like I had passed my trail, so I turned my headlamp on to find the reflective pen. After I found it, I was turning around as I shut it off, and there was about 6 to 8 pairs of red glowing eyes, about 1 to 2 feet off the ground, staring at me. I tried shining my light directly at them, but I was never able to see what they were, and they never moved or blinked. I was a bit freaked out, so I just drew my sidearm and continued up the trail to my blind. Now, even 10 years later, every time I walk that 2-track trail, I look at that spot, but I've never seen those eyes again. My family has a hunting property in the mountains where there's no cell phone service, internet, or even a landline. I go there by myself often, and in the event of an emergency, have no way to call for help unless I can get to my vehicle and drive far enough away to get cell service. So I'm very safety conscious. Anyway, one night I was leaving the property after dark. When I approached the gate in my vehicle, there was a loud explosion. My hunting partner and I was not alone this time, had to get out, unlock and relock the gate thinking someone might be genuinely trying to kill us. Later, through asking around, we discovered that some local men who live in that area thought it was funny to set out some Tannerite nearby and shoot it when we exited our property. One of them in particular is a severe alcoholic, known for brandishing loaded weapons at people. I'm always concerned that he'll come around whenever I'm there, and since I'm a woman, I worry that he might try to harass me, even worse than he has my male relatives. I was duck hunting with my dad and his friend while I was a young kid on the backwaters of the Mississippi River. It was a late season, and ice was starting to form, and only one other hunter was out that day. The blind was in open water, but ice was slowly building from the shoreline. The water was fairly deep. My dad and his buddy could walk in it, but as a kid, it was just over my chest waders deep, so I stepped out of the boat directly into the duck blind. After a while, someone wounds a duck, and my dad takes the boat out to try to retrieve the downed bird. At the same time, the only other hunter decides he is done for the day and starts heading to the boat ramp. Instead of cutting out the open water in front of us, he breaks ice all the way back, loosening a giant chunk of ice. The wind happens to be blowing from this direction, so now a giant chunk of ice is bearing down on the blind. The ice is not thick enough to walk on, but it's heavy enough to start to cave in the duck blind. Dad's friend gets out and is trying to break it piece by piece to keep it from completely collapsing the blind while I'm in it. And I'm shooting up all my rounds trying to get my dad's attention to come back to the blind. He finally comes back and I get in the boat. A few minutes after, we get all the decoys picked up. The ice completely collapses the duck blind. We move to another location and keep hunting. I ended up shooting a ruddy duck that day. It was my second ever duck, and still the only ruddy duck I have ever gotten. A buddy and I went hunting over a long weekend a few years ago. We hiked into our hunting terrain and stayed in a tent. This was in the middle of nowhere in the Norwegian wilderness, and we had exclusive hunting rights to that area, so we didn't really expect any other people to be there. No cell service within something like a 5 to 6 kilometer radius, and something like 10 kilometers to our cars. We were camped next to a small lake, and didn't see any other people there for the first couple of days. On our last night there, we were eating dinner next to our campfire pretty late at night, so everything outside our immediate surroundings was pitch black. Suddenly, we heard someone take a shot on the other side of the lake with what sounded like a rifle. We thought it was a bit strange, since there shouldn't have been any other hunters anywhere close by, but we just figured that someone was messing around further away than it sounded like. We forgot about it and settled back in to eat. After another 5 to 10 minutes, someone took a second shot, which sounded like it came from much closer to us. This time, the bullet hit some rocks right next to us, like 5 meters or so. We both sort of froze for like a few seconds while looking at each other, and then just ran to our tent to pick up our shotguns. We then ran quite a ways into the woods and just hunkered down. After a few minutes, we heard another shot, and we were pretty sure that it hit our tent, which later turned out to be correct. We obviously had no idea of what to do. We couldn't call the cops since there was no cell service, and it was completely dark, so we couldn't really hike out of there without using flashlights, which seemed like a terrible idea. We ended up finding a downed tree with a little cave-like thing under the roots, and just sat there until morning. We then packed up as quickly as possible, and basically ran back to our cars where we called the cops. The cops took it pretty seriously, it seemed like, but nothing ever came out of the investigation. We still have no idea what happened or who could have possibly done it. There was absolutely no reason for anyone to be out there with a gun, unless they were poachers, which is almost unheard of in Norway. I've never been so scared in my life, and it definitely